I'm Sarah Williamson, and this is Going Long with FCLT Global. On this show, you'll learn what it means to be long-term from the top minds in global business and investing. Leaders from companies and investment organizations join us to discuss how they are leading their teams for the long run on issues including capital allocation, risk management, climate change, and sustainability. To learn more, visit our website at fcltglobal.org. Robert C. Pozen is currently a senior lecturer at MIT School of Management and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. During his distinguished career, Bob has been active in business, government, and academia, notably as executive chairman of MFS and vice chairman of Fidelity Investments. Bob frequently writes for the Financial Times, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Harvard Business Review. In 2012, he won acclaim for a popular book entitled Extreme Productivity: Boost Your Results, Reduce Your Hours. In 2021, he published a book on working remotely entitled Remote Inc., How to Thrive at Work Wherever You Are, very prescient for the times. And today in particular, we're going to focus on some of the work that Bob has been doing on executive compensation. So Bob, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Sarah.
So as you know, at Focusing Capital on the Long Term, we've thought a lot about incentives, what drive people, how do we try to get investors and managers to make the right long-term decisions. And one of those topics that often comes up is executive compensation. So as we look at the growth of CEO pay these days, it's causing both shareholders and policymakers to question companies' compensation plans, especially given we're hopefully coming out of a pandemic that has highlighted income inequality. So why are we seeing pay go up so much despite the dips in performance due to COVID-19?
I think there are two reasons. One is there are some companies that have done very well because of the pandemic. Let's take Zoom, for instance. That's done very well, and various video game companies. So there are good reasons for the CEO pay to go up. But the real question is, what about all those companies where revenue went down, earnings went down? And, I think we have a general problem that boards of directors are pretty generous on the upside and really struggle on the downside. They struggle to take CEO paid down, even if the performance of the company is really down. Now, I think one of the reasons is the compensation consultants all present evidence to the compensation committees showing, what's the 50th percentile, what's the 75th percentile, and most boards don't like to think of their CEOs as average. So a lot of them pick the 75th percentile. And if you do that over time, it escalates. Another reason is here we had a particular problem, the pandemic, which is very challenging for CEOs. And so a board might say, even though the company's revenue went down, even though its earnings went down, this executive did a very skillful job in managing through this pandemic. And that would be a reason for CEO pay to go up. But the question is, how do you know that a CEO has been skillful in managing the downside? And that's a complicated question, but you would want to see, for instance, if it's an airline company, you would want to see, well, how well did this company do relative to other airlines? And that should be a partial measure of the performance of the CEO. So we really want to see a lot tougher analysis than just saying, well, times were bad and the CEO was skillful in dealing with those challenges. Yes, that's an important point, but the question was he or she more skillful than CEOs in similar positions?
So one of the challenges that all CEOs have is that they're managing over these multiple time horizons. So as you said, they have to manage through this current crisis, but they're also trying to lay the groundwork for the future, build succession, train their people, all of those things that are longer term. But a lot of pay gets very anchored in the short term. So, yeah, how do we think about the best ways to balance those? So obviously it is important to be skillful coming through a crisis, but also encourage and balance that long-term performance as well.
Well, I agree totally. A lot of CEO pay is based on the last year's performance, and that's relevant to some degree. But if we want CEOs to take a longer term approach, we're not talking in most cases 20 years, we're talking at least 3 or 5 years. There are a few things we could do. One is, what's the baseline performance period against which performance is measured? People are now focused on deferral of some portion of CEO pay, and I think that's legitimate and well done. But why are we on 1 year? Why are we not on going back 3 years, 5 years, depending on the industry? In an oil and gas industry that's very cyclical, you want to sort of cover several of the cycles. In areas like drug development, 3 and 5 years are very relevant, but we don't see that very much. We see mainly 1 year. A second thing is that you want to have CEOs, when they get stock awards that get released after a vesting period, and when they get stock options, you really want to see them hold on to some portion of that stock. We understand that there's a tax bill to be paid, but if we ask them to hold on to, say, 50 or 40% of the shares, then they'd have a more long-term incentive. Now we have many CEOs who exercise stock options and the very next day or the same day sell all those shares. And really that's not encouraging long-term behavior. And then the third thing is, on stock grants, which in many companies become quite big, the question is, are they time vested just because the CEO stays in the office for 3 years, or do they have a performance condition? And I think as shareholders, we would all like to see some performance conditions, and those should be over longer periods, such as building revenue, building earnings. And now that companies have started to talk the talk about ESG, if they're going to walk the walk, some of these longer term conditions for stock grants should be related to E or S or G, whatever the company thinks is appropriate. I'm not trying to come up with the answers, but really say we need a longer term approach and we need conditions that are relevant to ESG. We need conditions that are relevant to earnings and revenues.
And I think one of the things that we've seen in the work we've done, to your point, is that there tends to be sort of convergence to sort of a one-size-fits-all mindset, even though businesses are so different from each other. So if you think about, a simple example of a small startup versus a well-established company, you would expect them to have really different kinds of compensation systems. But we often see sort of the pressure from the institutional investment community or others towards that kind of one size fits all. So how do we encourage compensation committees to be a little bit more tailored, or as you said, they're stray a bit from perhaps what their consultants have told them, and really make something that's more theirs?
I think what they have to think about, what are the real drivers of long-term growth? We're going to, I think, see more and more in the MD&A part of the 10K. We're going to see more and more people that are going to articulate business plans, longer term business plans with KPIs, key performance indicators. And those are the ones that need to be linked in to compensation plans. And because those business plans, as you say, will be quite different for a small biotech company versus a mature drug company, or for a software company versus a hardware company. These are very different situations, and they ought to be treated differently. But if we start to push companies to give us a long-term plan, then that's the way to move them toward more customized executive comp criteria, because these plans will almost inherently be different and be appropriate for the company. And so rather than just taking these criteria out of the blue or from a consultant report, they'll be geared to what the business plan. And I think we'll see the SEC later this year, at least on climate change, come out with more disclosure rules. And I'm now a US trustee of the IFRS Foundation, which is starting a new sustainability board at the end of this year. So I think we'll see companies more and more in the MD&A also explaining, what's their proposal, what's their plan, what's their pathway for climate change. And then some of those key indicators should be linked back to the compensation plan. I don't think we're really going to believe that companies are committed to what they say they want to do in climate change unless at least part of the CEO comp is dovetailed to that.
So it sounds easy, right? Lay out a long-term plan, take a good guess about climate scenarios, how a company's going to transition, put out KPIs, measure them at least in part against those KPIs. But to your point, it's pretty rare. It's pretty rare that people do that. And oftentimes they fall back on TSR or something much more short term, like earnings or even adjusted earnings. So how do we shift from the shortcuts, because the long-term roadmap, the KPIs and so on make perfect sense, but the market has this tendency to use shortcuts like TSR or short-term earnings.
I think TSR is appropriate as part of the criteria for uh, uh, compensation, but it has to be relative to the right peer group. And companies, as I've discovered by studying this, have a tendency to put together a peer group that has much larger companies and companies with very high CO pay. But if the peer group is done correctly, then relative TSR over 3 years or 5 years makes a lot of sense. As to adjusted earnings, as you know, Sarah, I'm definitely a critic of adjusted earnings because some of these adjustments are so large that you take a company from a loss position to a profit position. And the one that's most troublesome is the way in which tech companies especially decide, well, we're not going to subtract any expense for stock options or stock related grants. Now that's a fight that happened as much as almost 20 years ago about whether you had that as an expense, should you account for it. And so they're refighting that last war. But the result is that we're looking at a company's earnings without this big chunk of expense that's directly related to the executives involved in the comp plan. So it's almost ironic that that's the expense that's being neglected. More generally, I wrote a piece in Harvard Business Review a few years ago pointing out how adjusted earnings are now 80 to 90% of companies are using them in compensation reports. And what we really need are two things. One is a reconciliation to GAAP, so we know what exactly they're doing. And second of all, an explanation about why these are better metrics for performance than GAAP. Now, I'm not trying to say you should never use adjusted earnings. They might be very appropriate, but we really need those two things. I'm happy to say that since I wrote that article, we now have almost 40% of companies that are including some sort of appendix to their proxy statement in which they are reconciling to GAAP. So I think that's a really positive development, because without that, I got to say, I read those compensation committee reports and I struggle to understand what exactly is being adjusted and how it's being adjusted. But we still don't see many companies explaining, well, why is this adjusted earnings metric better than other measures of performance? We know that performance is difficult to measure, but we need an explanation. If you're adjusting earnings by taking out all stock-related comp, we need to understand, why is that better than leaving it in as GAAP requires? And so far, we don't have those sorts of explanations. Together with the Council of Institutional Investors, we put a petition, a rulemaking petition, before the SEC a few years ago, asking for the SEC simply to require a reconciliation to GAAP in the compensation committee reports or in an addendum for companies that use adjusted earnings as one of the metrics for CEO comp. The SEC really didn't respond under the President Trump era, and I'm hopeful that with the new SEC leadership, that will be high on their agenda. Quite frankly, they've already done some of that in quarterly press releases, where when companies use adjusted earnings in quarterly press releases, they have to give right at the same time, with equal prominence, the GAAP numbers. So it really would be just application of that principle that's already there for quarterly earnings releases to compensation reports. So it's not that big a leap for the SEC, but so far they haven't taken it. I'm hopeful that they will make that transition over the next year or two.
Well, I know there's a lot on the SEC's plate, so I want to come back to that for sure. They've got a lot of people asking them to do a lot of things. So, but on the comp, one of the trends we've seen, of course, recently is say on pay, and investors voting in terms of compensation packages and so on. And obviously now this say on pay is even extending to, say on climate and so on. But sticking with say on pay, do you think it works? Is this a good system that we've got? Is it better than the alternative?
Well, I think it's again a step forward to have a explicit vote by shareholders on the compensation committee report. And we should be clear that the vote isn't on CEO pay, it's on the compensation committee report. So we're talking not only about what the pay package is, but how it's explained and what its metrics are. And I think that's an important distinction. But the problem is that we have a number of companies where there are significant votes against the compensation committee report, and they don't seem to respond by changing their compensation. Probably the most blatant example is Oracle, which has had very high comp and has had quite a strong vote against those plans over a few years, but they still continue to do so. So if we look at Europe, some European countries have binding votes on say on pay, and actually they don't get negative votes that often, maybe 2 or 3% of the time. But when they do, then the board must revise the pay. So I've proposed a sort of intermediate idea, which is the first time you get an advisory vote, it's up to you to whether you're going to change it. But if you get 2 or 3 advisory votes in a row against you, at some point it should become binding. So that's the change I'd like to see. But legal beagles will tell me whether or not you need Congress to do that or whether the SEC could do that on its own. So that's probably a point of controversy.
Yeah, that makes sense. You get one strike, but not a whole lot. So that makes sense. That makes sense. So, going back to Europe, there are Norges Bank, the big sovereign fund, has written something which you probably saw a couple of years ago about simply saying that executives should hold stock for very long periods of time, including post tenure, including after they retire or after they leave. So maybe 5, 7, 10 years. I think that hasn't gotten much take up around the world. But if you think about private companies, it's often the case that family members or executives would hold shares for that long period of time. Why do you think that and of course, what we've seen oftentimes is that a new CEO comes in, writes things down. You get this sort of sawtooth pattern where things go well, new CEO comes in, they write things down, then that happens again and again. And so if the prior CEO had held the stock after their departure, they would have eaten their own cooking a little bit. But why hasn't that had as much take up as it sounds like on the surface it perhaps should?
I can only speculate, but I think the reason is that people feel that once you step down as a CEO, you're no longer in control of the levers. And so therefore you shouldn't be hit if the company's performance goes down because it's not within your control. But the problem, as you've just pointed out, is that companies that do large acquisitions that turn out to be very poor, AT&T is a good example. Look at what they're getting for the Time Warner acquisition that they paid a huge amount for, and they're maybe getting half the value. Same thing with what they did with DirecTV, worse what they got. So at the time, the CEO of the acquisition, the CEO was rewarded for doing this brilliant acquisition. It didn't work out. He leaves, the new person comes in, he either spins them out or sells them at a loss, and then it seems like no one takes the hit. So I agree with you that we ought to have some period beyond the end of your stint as CEO for you to hold on to the stock. How long that should be, I think is probably fair to say maybe 2 or 3 years would be more appropriate, because whatever the problems that the former CEO caused would sort of come out within the next few years. So I think the other thing is, if you say, as we've just suggested, that when a CEO gets stock from stock grants or options, that he or she needs to hold them until they leave as being CEO, then there could be an incentive to leave when the stock price is high. And we don't want to encourage that. But I think sort of in the end, people seem to feel intuitively that once the CEO steps down, he's no longer or she's no longer responsible for corporate performance. And that's clearly true after some time. But maybe if we at least got the CEO to hold on for a year after he or she stepped down, that'd be a step in the right direction.
So one question that has come up, particularly across countries, is how much should a CEO be rewarded for performance in a classic sense of the word? So if you think about a simple piece worker who gets paid, $5 for every widget they make, right? That's the most direct. Whereas CEOs, their both responsibilities, their control, their intellectual stimulation, their psychic benefits are much broader than sort of your classic piece worker who gets paid to hit something. So how do you think about sort of more philosophically, because I know in the US, as a general rule, we tend to lean towards pay for performance. In some other countries, it's not quite as tight, and the intrinsic motivation is meant to be stronger, legacy, reputation, things that are soft. Is it a pipe dream to lean on those sorts of things, or could we help ourselves by leaning a little bit more on those intangibles?
Well, I think that as a person who was in charge of compensation for a large number of highly compensated analysts and portfolio managers, I found that it's useful to have, say, 20% of comp related to things that are soft, like leadership or marketing, where it's hard to identify an objective criteria. But I also found that unless 80% of the comp is related to objective criteria, it's very hard to mark somebody down. If you have a sitting CEO, what do you say to her? Well, we're marking you down, only giving you half of what you need on leadership or what you could have earned on leadership. So then the CEO feels that's a big slap in the face, and it's very hard to do. And a lot of boards essentially won't do that unless they're planning to fire the CEO. So I think these soft criteria conceptually seem to be relevant, but in practice, they make it very difficult for compensation committees to mark down the CEO, which is already a challenge for them. What I think makes sense is to have some criteria related to revenue growth and earnings, not adjusted earnings, but real earnings, and then to have some specific ESG targets that are integrated, as we've discussed, to the business plan of that company and really make sense over a period of 3 to 5 years. And many of those ESG criteria, including the G and the S, the social and the government, some of them are softer than things like earnings and revenue growth. So I think that's a better way to go than just saying, let's have 20% of the comp being related to legacy or leadership. Those are tough. I mean, how are we actually going to know whether the CEO succeeded or didn't? I think those are sort of done on an intuitive judgment basis, and people on comp committees are very reluctant to mark down the CEO on those types of criteria. It's tough. So I think we can have some, let's say, non-revenue and non-earnings components, but I'd like to see them be tied to the KPIs in the business plan rather than some relatively vague concept like legacy or leadership.
Makes sense. And one of the things that we've talked a little bit about is obviously the Business Roundtable made a statement about a year and a half ago about the purpose of companies serving multiple stakeholders, not just the shareholder. Part of that is related to ESG, as you've just talked about, but part of that is about being long-term, building something that is sustainable over long periods of time. Part of that is thinking about the many stakeholders that a company may have. Do you think that that purpose statement can be baked into compensation discussions, or is that too soft? Is that too high and it needs to be more metrics?
I'm going to say the same thing about that I just said relative to legacy and leadership, but more specific. That is, if a company decides that it's not going to judge a CEO just on what shareholder measures like earnings and revenue over the long term, but it wants to have a measure of related to employee and employee satisfaction. So if that's part of its broad stakeholder approach, as we see in various European companies, then we ought to try to figure out KPIs that are relevant to that and put that into the CEO comp. So for instance, you could say if employee as stakeholders were really important to you, you want to have a minimum wage above a certain amount, you want to be higher than the median of the industry for comp. You want to sort of have very good programs for health and safety for your workers. So if we're going to go to stakeholder capitalism in the US, or I think probably more precisely move a few steps in that direction toward long-term stakeholder capitalism, we need to develop KPIs and criteria first in the business plan, and then we need to dovetail them and integrate them into comp plans so that they really have some effectiveness. If you see a business roundtable company that's talking about stakeholder capitalism, but then when you look at its CEO comp, it's all on earnings and revenues, you've got to say, well, what about all these other stakeholders? Where are the KPIs that are relevant to that? Now, we've started to see that a little. We have a few companies where they're reducing their carbon footprint is part of their CEO comp. And so what they've done is they're really saying, we're looking at this broader concept of stakeholder capitalism, and we're now integrating it into CEO comp. But if we have companies talking, US companies, about this new concept of stakeholder capitalism, and we have no KPIs for anything other than revenue or earnings, I think it sort of suggests that we really don't have an effective system of moving towards stakeholder capitalism.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've learned at FCLT time and again is that incentives are critical, and that, you know, to use your words, to take a few steps towards a long-term stakeholder capitalism, having the incentives align with that is critical. And the incentives might be as tight as compensation. They could be other things, but if there are incentives pushing the other way, it certainly doesn't happen. So that makes a lot of sense. Well, I know we're almost out of time. Last question I really wanted to ask you is about moving back to the point you made on the IFRS and the Sustainability Standards Board that's underway, and all the pressures on the SEC. If you could give the SEC sort of a list of the highest value, they're the top of their list to push forward some of these concepts. What do you think is it supporting IFRS as they put in place, hopefully a Sustainability Standards Board? Is it what's your advice if you could get them to move in the right direction?
I would give the SEC advice to support the establishment of a sustainability board, because I think it will provide a way to move toward a more uniform standard across the world. I think the IFRS is only trying to do what we call a core set of standards, and that some people argue, well, the SEC would give up its sovereignty if it went to a core set of standards set by an international board. But the SEC isn't going to say, we support the board and we're going to automatically do every single thing they say. They're going to take the standards that are promulgated by the board, and then they're going to put them in a rulemaking proceeding, and there very likely will be some modifications. So I think that is the probably single highest thing that the SEC should do. Second of all, there are certain remnants of the Trump administration that I'd like to see change. I do think that the rules about proxy advisors were a little too tight. And while there are legitimate concerns about conflicts of interest, I think those rules went a little too far and should be changed. I do think that we have a third area is we haven't changed the numerical requirements for private offerings since 1983. So they're still at 200,000 of income or $1 million of net worth. Now, in 1983, that meant a pretty wealthy person who not only is likely to have an advisor, but is also able to have certain losses and absorb those losses. But now, really, if we did it on an inflation adjusted basis, that 200,000 would probably be 5 or 600,000, and that million would be much higher. So we want to have private markets open to investors, but on the other hand, we all know that private markets have less disclosure, less liquidity, so we should be careful on that. Instead, what the prior administration did is they opened the private market more broadly by saying if you have take a certain brokerage test, then you're qualified. Now, again, some of these tests did relate to private markets, but others didn't. They were just the general brokerage. So those are the three things that I'd like to see changed in areas that are sort of disclosure oriented. The SEC has plenty else to consider with the phenomenon of Robinhood and the various issues with market structure, but I'm not an expert on those, and I'm not going to wade into those.
Well, you're an expert on many, many things, and you've also been such a leader in this field and an inspiration to those of us who try to follow. And so I just, I thank you for your time today, for your work that really does help build, as our mission is to rebalance capital markets to support a long-term sustainable economy. And your work has been doing that in spades. So we really appreciate your time, your leadership, and we will continue to follow the work that you do with great interest, because whatever you pick up seems to be the topic, the most important topic of the day.
Well, Sarah, I'm a big supporter of what your organization and you're doing, and I do believe that all the emphasis on long-term capitalism and having a broader view toward capitalism is appropriate. But I also feel unless those concerns, those issues are integrated into executive pay, it's sort of like a hypothetical exercise. If we really want people to pay attention to the long term, if we really want them to pay attention to ESG, some of those criteria have to be in executive pay, because as you say, incentives are important to have how people operate. And if we're basing, most of CEO pay on last year's adjusted earnings, then we're unlikely to get those CEOs to be focused on long-term growth and other issues. So I think you and I are totally in sync on this. And I believe that the effort to integrate now the insights that your group has really pushed and explored on long-term capital and a broader capital approach, if we could integrate them into executive pay, then we'd start to really have people paying attention and changing behaviors. And ultimately, that's what we need to do to get to the goals of your organization, which I strongly support. So thank you for all of your work and for your efforts in this area.
Thank you. And you've put out a high bar, so we'll reach for that one. Thank you. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Going Long with FCLT Global. Be sure to hit subscribe to get new episodes every other Monday. To learn more, visit our website at fcltglobal.org.